Hi, I'm Mark and I've been working in sound engineering for the last 15 years. Today we're going to be speaking a bit about acoustics. I currently work at Black Box Pro as an acoustics consultant, and I'd like to share some of the information that we normally use, some of the plans and some of the basic principles that we normally consider every time we're designing a studio. We're going to focus a bit more on bedroom studios, so we're looking at the most basic principles, keeping in mind a more of a low budget, limited kind of setup for any producer who's going to start his journey into music production. So one of the first principles that we must consider is where we're going to place your workstation. So this will involve all the synthesizers or drum machines, controllers, your mouse and keyboard, your monitor, computer, and of course your studio monitors. Ideally, you should always set up the workstation along the shortest wall of your room. We have to assume that, for simplicity's sake, we have to assume that the room is a rectangle, which most, 9 out of 10 rooms I think that I come across are rectangular rooms. So when faced with a rectangular room, we want to set up the workstation on the shortest wall. There are a few reasons for using the shortest wall for your workstation. The main one being bass response. Bass tends to sound flatter across the frequency range when you have the speakers firing down the length of the room rather than the width of the room. Now this is of course not always possible due to existing furniture in your room, for example wardrobes or beds, all sorts of things, different furniture you might have in your bedroom. But having said that, if you can spare the flexibility of moving some furniture around to accommodate for your workstation, it really does make a big difference when you set up along the width. So first reason, your bass response is going to be more even. The second reason is you want to distance yourself from the reflections on the back wall as much as you can. So when you set up along the length of the room, you automatically are the furthest away from the back wall so that you don't have too much reflections. The sound will obviously die over a distance. Reflections will be less strong the further they travel. So if you distance yourself as much as you can from the back wall, you will always get less reflections. The third reason is something to do with the listening position in the room. So ideally, you avoid the center of the room when placing yourself to work on your music. If the center of the room basically has a strong bass now, this is where most of the bass will be cancelled out. So if you're mixing down a track from the middle of the room, say you have a 5-meter long room and you place yourself at 2.5 meters from both walls, basically in the center. Over there, the bass will be basically non-existent or very, 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 very low compared to the mid-range and high frequencies. What will happen then is that you will mix all your tracks very bass heavy. You go to listen to it somewhere on another system, in a car, in your mate's studio, or on a consumer device, and you'll realize that your bass is very overwhelming because you are making up for that cancellation due to your listening position. So it's very important to avoid the center of the room when we're talking about the length of the room, distance away from the front wall. So once we've set up your workstation along the length of the room, and we're avoiding the 50% of the distance, so to avoid the bass downs, which position should you be set up? Should you be set up at 25%, at 40%? It really depends on the room. But as a general rule, to start with, as a general starting point, we normally start from 38% from the front wall, which is the wall where your monitors are. So in a room which is 10 meters long, you would look at positioning yourself at 3.8 meters. Of course, this is a very large room, 10 meters, so you just have to work 38% of the distance of your room. From there, you should kind of listen to the bass response in your room, moving forward and back to see where it sounds best. But around 35 to 42%, I think, of the length of the room is where you should be at. So once you find your listening position, which is in this 35 to 42% of the wall, you want to position your monitors. So how wide should you position them, and how close to yourself should you position them? This also is affected by the size of your monitors. So for most bedroom producers, I would not recommend main monitors, of course. So we're looking at near field monitors, and 5 to 6 inch woofers I think would be ideal, with obviously 6-inch woofers having a bit better bass response. With 8-inch woofers, they could also be used in certain bedrooms, provided that the distance from the side walls and the back wall, you know, they have a little bit more space. So let's go. Well, the most popular model would be the 6-inch near field monitor. So you want to position yourself in an equilateral triangle between the two monitors and your listening position, which we call the reference point. So let's say your monitors are 1.5 meters apart. You need to be approximately 1.5 meters away from each monitor, with the point of the 1.5 meters, the reference point, being somewhere behind your head. So you need to be sitting just inside this equilateral triangle. This will provide the best frequency response, the most flat frequency response from your monitors, with the least coloration and acoustic interference from the positioning itself. So once we've positioned ourselves in this equilateral triangle, the next thing to think about is your monitor height, right? So high frequencies are much more directive than low frequencies. So when you look at your monitor speaker, you're going to have a low frequency driver, which is a woofer, and the tweeter, or the high frequency driver. Ideally, you should have the monitors positioned at a height where the tweeters are at the same height as your ears. Plus or minus a few centimeters is okay, but you should never have the monitors either too low or too high. If you do have them too low or too high, you will have a lack of high frequencies in your reference position, and you will of course mix everything a little bit too bright to make up for that incorrect positioning. So as you can see, acoustics and positioning yourself, it's all about getting the flattest response, so that all the decisions that you make with regards to frequency balance are not biased or are not influenced by incorrect positioning of yourself within the room or your monitors in reference to your position. One of the most common questions I get asked about speaker placement, monitor placement, is how far should they be from the wall behind them? With most people thinking that they shouldn't be too close to the wall because of low frequency shelving. This is true. So if you do have your monitors very close to the wall behind, you will get a low frequency shelving. So you will notice a boost in frequency response from, let's say, 200 hertz or maybe even 300 hertz down. So this does color the sound, but it does it in a predictable way, which means, and it does it at all the frequencies, which means that it can easily be corrected. A more serious problem when positioning your monitors. So placing your monitors away from the back wall will help in reducing this low frequency shelving, but it does introduce a more complicated issue, which is a little bit harder to deal with than low frequency shelving, and this is called SBIR. It's basically speaker boundary interference, or what some people call it the boundary effect. When you place your monitors away from the back wall, you introduce certain cancellations in the frequency response that are related to the distance from the wall. Low frequencies radiate from the speaker both forward and backward, unlike mid or high frequencies, which radiate just forward from the monitor. So what's happening is that the sound from your monitor is traveling back to the wall and reflecting off the wall and coming back to the front of the monitor, where it reacts with the direct sound from the monitor and actually causes a lot of phase cancellations. In practical terms, when you listen to this, what you will hear is that certain notes, especially one particular note, will be completely cancelled out, and this causes a big null in your bass frequency. So if you're listening to a bass line from a bass guitar or from a bass synth, if one of the notes falls within this cancellation, the note will be virtually non-existent within the bass line. Also, if the bass is in key of the cancellation itself, you will end up again boosting that frequency to make up. But what you will notice is that boosting the frequency does not fix the problem. And this is the first sign that shows you that it's actually a cancellation, because the more you boost something upwards, the more the cancellation is going downwards. So eventually it will always stay the same. In order to avoid this, you need to move the speakers as close to the wall as possible, because the closer the speaker is to the wall, the higher the frequency of cancellation will be. And the higher the frequency of cancellation will be, the easier it is to absorb with inexpensive acoustic treatment. So we've got the basics, right? You have you set up your workstation along the length of the room. You've positioned yourself around the 38% of that length. You have your monitors as close as you can to the back wall to avoid speaker boundary interference. And you've positioned yourself in an equilateral triangle. So what about the actual treatment itself? So let's start where we left off with speaker boundary. So we've pushed the monitors up against the wall, and now we have a cancellation that is further up the frequency spectrum. Let's call it around 250 or 300 hertz. So if you have a cancellation at 300 hertz, the way to deal with this is that you put acoustic treatment behind the monitors, sufficient acoustic treatment behind the monitors to deal with that cancellation. So if the sound is moving back from the monitor and reflecting off the wall, and then coming back to interfere with the direct sound, what we need to do is stop that reflection. Now, by pushing the speaker to the wall, we've managed to push that frequency up. So absorbing a 300 hertz reflection is going to be much easier than absorbing, let's say, a 80 hertz or 100 hertz reflection. So now the sound moving back from the monitor is being absorbed by the acoustic treatment that we've placed there. So it's not coming back and interfering with the direct sound from the monitor. And so the speaker boundary interference has been dealt with in a relatively easy way by moving the speaker back to the wall. So you push the cancellation frequency up to a point where the acoustic treatment, where basic acoustic treatment, like for example 3 or 2 inch, maybe 3 inch mineral wool panels or 12 centimeter thick foam panels can actually absorb those frequencies. So once we've dealt with the cancellations coming from behind your monitors, it's time to think about the early reflections, or the first reflections from your sidewalls and from the ceiling. If you had the most limited budget and you had just the ability to place 2 or 4 or 6 panels to treat your room, the ideal positions would have to be the sidewalls and the ceiling. This is where the most destructive interference from reflections is happening, because you are sat in your position listening to your monitors, and the sound from your monitors doesn't really travel in a straight line. It's being projected outwards from the speaker itself, reflecting off the walls and arriving into your ears a few milliseconds later than the direct sound. This causes a lot of comb filtering, which is basically a lot of cancellations and peaks and dips in the frequency response. And in order to avoid this, you need to put some sort of acoustic treatment on the side walls where the first reflection points are, and also on the ceiling where the first reflection points are. The best way to identify the first reflection points is to sit in your listening position, as we described in the beginning, and have someone move a mirror along, like flat up against the wall, along the length of the room, where you can actually see the reflection of your monitor in the mirror. That is your first reflection point. You can look it up on the internet, the mirror technique for monitor placement. There's a lot of videos and a lot of tutorials on how to do this. So once you have all this in place, so your first reflections are okay, the cancellations in the back of the monitors from speaker boundary interference is sorted as well, it's time to think about bass traps. So there are many different bass traps you can use in a bedroom studio, but for considering the low budget of most bedroom studios, we will stick to talking about porous absorbers, which is basically foam chunks or mineral wool chunks which we place in corners. I've rarely walked into a studio which had too much bass traps, so you can have too much mid-range and high absorption very easily because it will deaden the room. So with regards to the amount of bass traps in your room, yes, you can have too much bass traps, but normally you're going to be limited by your budget before you run out of how many bass traps you should have. So ideally you should treat either all four corners with at least 3 of these foam bass traps, or you can try having four bass traps floor to ceiling on your front wall. This would be a very good place to start. Bear in mind, foam bass traps, what we call porous absorbers, are very good in dealing with general bass problems like boosty. Foam bass traps are good to deal with general bass problems such as boomy rooms, but they do very little for room modes, which tend to be more in the sub region. So we're talking about 40 Hertz, 50 Hertz, 60 Hertz. Foam bass traps to absorb 60 Hertz and down need to be quite chunky, and I'm talking about 1 meter deep, 1.2 meter deep bass traps, which normally in a bedroom you will never have that sort of space. So I will always recommend to deal with the 80 and 100 Hertz up bass region, not sub bass region, by using foam traps. There are things which can deal with room modes, such as tuned bass traps or limp mass absorbers, but they tend to be quite pricey and out of budget for most bedroom producers. So what I do recommend, that can not ideal, but it can deal with very well with room modes in this sub bass region, is room correction software. Something that a few brands have their own software, such as Genelec. They have their own software which corrects these room modes in the bass region without getting too crazy with a lot of expensive bass traps. And the combination of using porous absorbers with these foam bass traps to clean up the boominess around the 100 Hertz region, 100 to 200 Hertz region, and combined with a room correction software which will cost you a fraction of what the big high-end kind of bass traps would cost you. It's a very good way, it's a very good approach. It's not ideal, you wouldn't see it in an industrial studio, but for a bedroom studio, I think the technology that we have today, it really helps in achieving this flat bass response within a bedroom studio. One last thing before I finish is something that I come across a lot, is the lack of understanding of the materials that should be used. There is a lot of acoustic foam and acoustic products out there which do fix some issues within the room, but they kind of ignore the full range kind of approach to treating a room. So a lot of the thin, talk about 2.5, 3 centimeter or 1 inch thick foam panels, Some people tend to just cover the whole room with that, and it does change the acoustics of the room, but it does little in absorbing mid-range and low-mid frequencies. So what tends to happen is that you absorb all the mid-high and high frequencies in your room, and it sounds really dead and tight, but you've absolutely done nothing to absorb the low-mids and the mid-range of your room. So if you use bass traps, you kind of tamed the low end of your room, and then you use really thin foam panels all around the room. You've tamed the high end, and you're left with a very rich mid-range kind of acoustic field, you know. So you kind of want to use foam panels or mineral wool panels whose absorption coefficient you know. So what an absorption coefficient is the way that the material absorbs sound at different frequencies. So what you want from a broadband panel is something that can absorb efficiently, and when I say efficiently, it's like at least 0.6, a coefficient of 0.6, which is basically absorbing 60% of the sound that reflects of it, down to around 200 hertz. So if you find something that can absorb efficiently, you know, at least 60% of the sound down to around 200, 250 hertz, more realistically even 300 hertz, you'll be in a good spot. Avoid using thin, like, you know, 1 inch, like 2 centimeter thick foam or rock wool or stuff like that. The two things that factor into efficient absorption of you know, low mid frequencies are thickness and density. So you want something that is either really thick of medium density or medium thick of high density. This is very important in treating your room. If you need advice, you can always look up, get some advice from a professional on what sort of materials you should use, because it does play an important role in it, and you might end up wasting a lot of money on acoustic treatment that you don't actually need. So that's about it for today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark. You can find me at Black Box Pro if you need any sort of acoustic advice or design, or we also supply products as well, studio monitors. So check us out on Black Box Pro. You can find us online and also on social media. So if you want to delve deeper into the subject of acoustics, I do teach a course at Sawtooth Audio Academy, which is the basics or the fundamentals of sound, where we do get into much more detail about studio acoustics, not just on a bedroom level, bedroom studio level, but also into a more professional based approach. We discuss a lot of things which will help you get the best sound out of your room, whether it's a bedroom or a dedicated studio. So yeah, check out the course on Sawtooth Audio Academy.